The words landed across the supper table like a bullet nobody had heard fired. Grace Merritt sat with her fork halfway to her lips, her breath caught somewhere between her throat and the cool evening air drifting through the open window of the ranch house. The kerosene lamp between them threw amber light across Cyrus Finley's face, and she could see every line of it, the hard jaw, the careful eyes, the way his big hands lay flat on either side of his plate as though he were bracing himself against the table, and everything the table represented. "I built that room," he said again, quieter this time, as if saying it softer might make it easier for either of them to bear, "because I hoped you would stay." She set the fork down. The clink of silver against ceramic was the only sound in the house. Outside, somewhere beyond the dark fields of the Finley ranch, a coyote called and was answered. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. The world went on being the world, indifferent to the fact that Grace Merritt had just heard something that had the power to change the entire course of her life, and that she was not at all certain she deserved it. Because there was something Cyrus Finley did not know about her. A secret she had carried from San Antonio like a stone in her boot, pressing into the soft of her foot with every step, wearing her down to something raw and tender beneath. She had told herself it did not matter. She had told herself she would be gone before it mattered. She had told herself many things over these past 2 months on this ranch, and every single one of those things was now turning to ash in the warmth of what he had just said. He was watching her. His dark eyes did not move from her face, and there was a vulnerability in them that she had never seen in a man like Cyrus Finley, a man built from drought and hard work and long silences, a man who had not once in 63 days on this ranch asked her for a single thing except honesty, and honesty was the one thing she had withheld from him. "Cyrus," she said, and her voice came out wrong, cracked at the edges like old leather. "You do not have to say anything tonight," he told her. "I am not asking for an answer. I just needed you to know." But that was precisely what made it impossible to stay silent, because if she stayed silent now, she was choosing a lie by omission. And if there was one thing Grace Merritt had promised herself after everything that had happened in San Antonio, after the betrayal and the dark past, she had fled north with nothing but a carpetbag and a forged letter of introduction. It was that she would not build a new life on another rotten foundation. She pushed back from the table. She said, "There is something I have to tell you first." And the look that crossed his face then, not fear exactly, but a bracing, a man who has stood in the path of storms before and knows how to plant his feet, that look was what finally broke her open. She began at the beginning, the real beginning. It had started in the spring of 1883, in the city of San Antonio, Texas, in the back office of a man named Harlan Voss. Grace had been 24 years old, newly widowed after 6 months of marriage to a man named Thomas Merritt who had died of typhoid fever before she had even learned his habits well enough to dislike them. She had been left with his name, a small amount of debt, a rented room on Commerce Street, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes not from losing someone you love deeply, but from realizing you had been trying very hard to love someone and had simply run out of time. She was a school teacher, had been one since she was 18, first in her hometown of Fredericksburg and then in San Antonio, where the school board had been pleased to hire her, and even more pleased, she suspected, that she was a married woman and therefore a respectable one. When Thomas died, she received a polite but firm note from the school board chairman informing her that they would be reviewing her position, given the change in her circumstances. She had been angry enough about that to march herself down to the San Antonio Herald and respond to an advertisement she had seen twice before and ignored twice before. Wanted, a capable woman of good character and some education to serve as schoolteacher and household manager for a remote ranch operation in the territory of New Mexico. Applicant must be prepared for frontier conditions, wages to be negotiated. Reply to C. Finley, Finley Ranch, Cimarron County. She had written the letter with a fury that she had been careful to disguise beneath perfectly even penmanship. She had described herself accurately, her age, her education, her teaching experience, her widow's status, and then she had done the one dishonest thing. She had not mentioned Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss was the man who owned the note on Thomas Merritt's debts. He was also, it had become apparent in the weeks after Thomas died, a man who believed that Grace Merritt might serve as useful payment on those debts in ways that had nothing to do with money. He was powerful in San Antonio. He had friends on the city council and friends among the cattlemen's associations and friends, she suspected, in places considerably darker than either of those. When she had refused him with the kind of cold clarity that had taken every ounce of courage she possessed, he had smiled at her in a way that suggested he did not consider the matter settled. She had received the letter from Cyrus Finley 2 weeks later and had packed her trunk the same afternoon. What she told herself in those days of furious, secret planning was that she was simply relocating, that there was nothing dishonest about not volunteering every detail of one's private situation to a prospective employer, that she was a qualified teacher, that whatever mess she had left behind in San Antonio was Thomas's mess, not hers. What she did not tell herself, because it was too frightening to examine directly, was that she was running, that she was using Cyrus Finley's ranch as a hiding place, that she had accepted his offer of employment with something hidden in her luggage that he had never agreed to carry. She had arrived at Cimarron County on a Thursday in late March of 1883, stepping off the stage at the town of Hartwell with her single carpetbag and her larger trunk, and the bright, purposeful expression of a woman who has decided to reinvent herself through sheer force of will. Cyrus Finley had been waiting at the stage stop with a wagon and a pair of gray mules. She had recognized him immediately, not from a description, because his letter had contained none, but from something in the way he stood. Slightly apart from the small knot of people gathered at the stage stop, arms crossed but not aggressively, watching the road with the patience of a man who has spent his whole life watching horizons. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, with dark hair that wanted cutting, and a sunburned face that had been organized at birth into something that was not quite handsome in the conventional sense, but was deeply, uncomfortably interesting to look at. He had the lean, maintained look of a man who worked every day and ate simply, and slept hard and asked nothing from the world except that it leave him alone to do his work. When she walked up to him and said, "Mr. Finley." "I am Grace Merritt." Something had moved through his eyes so quickly she almost missed it. A relief, she thought, or a recalibration, as though the woman who had stepped off that stage had not been precisely what he expected, and he was deciding right there, right then, in the space of a second and a half, how he felt about that. "Mrs. Merritt," he said. He did not smile, but something in his voice was warmer than his face suggested. "Glad you made the journey. Let me get your trunk." He had lifted her trunk into the wagon with the ease of someone who regularly moved things that weighed more than she did. She had climbed up beside him on the wagon seat. He had clicked to the mules and they had started the 2-hour drive out to the ranch, and in those 2 hours he had said perhaps 40 words total, and she had respected every single one of his silences, which she realized later had surprised him. The ranch itself had surprised her too. She had expected something spare and rough, the frontier equivalent of barely getting by. What she found instead was a property of quiet, serious competence. The main house was built of adobe and timber, solid and warm, with 4 rooms and a good stone fireplace. The barn was tight and well maintained. The corrals were built to last. There were 60 head of cattle on the south pasture and another 40 on the north, along with 12 horses, several hundred chickens organized into coops that had been built with a precision that said more about the builder's character than any biography could. There were 2 ranch hands, an older man named Delbert Cruz, who had worked for Cyrus's father before him, and a younger Mexican man named Esteban Rios who spoke excellent English and could ride anything on 4 legs. And there was a schoolroom. It was built onto the south side of the main house, a clean addition with two good windows facing east and a proper chalkboard that must have cost a considerable sum to ship to Cimarron County. There were 6 desks inside, all of them child-sized, and a teacher's desk at the front, and a small pot-bellied stove in the corner for winter. She had looked at that room for a long time the first afternoon, standing in the doorway while Cyrus stood behind her. "Whose children?" she had asked. "Ranchers in the valley," he said. 5 families within riding distance, 12 children between them. I wrote to their fathers when I put out the advertisement. They are all willing to send their children 3 days a week if you are willing to teach them." "And you?" she asked. "Do you have children?" There had been a pause. "No, I do not." She had turned to look at him then and found him looking at the schoolroom rather than at her, his face arranged in that careful, private way he had, and she had understood without being told that there was a story there, and that it was not the right moment to ask for it. She had not asked. That, she would later think, was when it had started. The teaching had been the easy part. The children arrived Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on horseback or by wagon, a collection of ages from 6 to 14, and Grace threw herself into the work with everything she had. She was a good teacher. She had always known this about herself, even when she doubted everything else, and the children responded to her with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of young people who had been starved for proper instruction. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography and a little natural science, and on Friday afternoons she read to them from whatever book she had managed to bring along or borrow, and the school on the south side of the Finley ranch became, within 3 weeks, the most purposeful place Grace had occupied in longer than she cared to count. Evenings were Cyrus's territory. The arrangement had been clear from the first. She managed the schoolroom and the domestic side of the house, for which she received a fair wage and her room and board. He managed the ranch. They shared supper because it was more sensible than cooking separately. It was a practical arrangement between 2 practical people, and Grace had told herself it would remain so. She had reckoned without the suppers themselves. They had begun in silence those first evenings, not an uncomfortable silence but a working one, each of them tired from the day and willing to let food do the talking. But Cyrus Finley, it turned out, was a man who asked good questions, not intrusive ones. Not the probing, opportunistic questions that men like Harlan Voss used to locate your weaknesses. Genuine ones, offered without pressure and received without expectation. He had asked about her teaching philosophy. She had given him a real answer, not a polished one. He had asked what she thought of the Rio Cimarron at flood and drought, and whether she had read anything about the river systems of the territory, and she had said no, and he had gone to the bookshelf in the parlor and come back with a surveyor's report from 1871 and a copy of Clarence King's Geological Survey, and they had sat at opposite ends of the table discussing watershed management until the lamp ran low. He had asked, one evening in April when a late-season snow had kept the children home, and the 2 of them had spent the day inside listening to the wind, what she had loved before she was a teacher. She had been startled enough to answer honestly. She had loved drawing. Botanical drawings mostly, learned from a Mexican woman in Fredericksburg who had learned it from her own grandmother. She had not drawn in years. He had said nothing. 2 days later, a small wooden case of drawing pencils and a pad of good paper had appeared on the teacher's desk, left there without comment. She had sat and looked at them for 10 minutes before she could make herself touch them. That was when she had understood she was in trouble. Because the forbidden feeling growing in her chest was not gratitude, or not only gratitude. It was something considerably more dangerous. It was the feeling of being known. The specific, terrifying warmth of having someone see not the widow or the schoolteacher or the respectable displaced woman, but something closer to the actual person underneath all those necessary costumes. And the secret she carried was not something a man like Cyrus Finley deserved to be kept in the dark about. His name was Harlan Voss. 47 years old, with money enough to make himself powerful and a character that ensured he used that power badly. He had been lending money to small ranchers and merchants across South Texas for a decade, and the ones who could not pay, which was most of them eventually, found that Voss had a long memory and a longer reach. Thomas Merritt had borrowed $200 from him to pay for a shipment of dry goods that had then been destroyed by a warehouse fire for which there was no insurance, because Thomas had been the kind of man who always meant to buy insurance and never quite got around to it. When Thomas died of typhoid, Voss had come to the funeral not out of any feeling, Grace understood, but to take stock of what he might recover from the situation. What he had proposed to her in his office 3 weeks after Thomas's burial, dressed in his city suit with his boots polished to a high shine and his thinning hair slicked flat, was not technically illegal. He would forgive the debt. He would ensure the school board reconsidered its position on her employment. He would take care of the arrangements for her rented room, which she could not currently afford without her teaching salary. In return, she would accept his company on a regular basis, and eventually, when things had settled, she would consider becoming his wife. The way he had said it made every one of those things sound like a trap. She had said no. He had said that he hoped she would reconsider. She had said no again and stood up and walked out, and gone home and written a letter to a stranger named Cyrus Finley in Cimarron County, New Mexico Territory, and had not looked back. What she had not expected was that Harlan Voss would look forward. The letter had arrived at the Finley Ranch in the last week of May. Grace had recognized the San Antonio postmark on the envelope and had felt the blood drain from her face as she stood at the mailbox at the end of the ranch road. She had opened it standing right there, in the late afternoon light, with the smell of cut grass around her and the sound of Cyrus working the horses in the far corral. The letter was not threatening in any language she could have brought to a sheriff and had him agree was threatening. It was polite, even pleasant in the smooth, lawyerly way that Voss had. He hoped she was well. He hoped the territory agreed with her. He wanted to let her know that the matter of Thomas's debt had not been concluded, and that he had taken the liberty of consulting with a lawyer who confirmed that, as the surviving heir, she had inherited not only her husband's name but his obligations. He would be in contact, he said, regarding an arrangement. He also mentioned, at the very end, almost as an afterthought, that he had business interests that were expanding northward into the New Mexico Territory, and that he expected to be traveling there before the end of the summer. She had stood at the mailbox until her legs stopped shaking. Then she had folded the letter, put it in the pocket of her apron, walked back to the house, and told herself she had time. She had told herself she would handle it. She had told herself, most foolishly of all, that there was no reason to involve Cyrus Finley in a problem that was hers alone. The days of June had been beautiful. That was the thing that haunted her afterward, how beautiful those days had been. The territory bloomed in early summer in ways she had not anticipated. The dry scrubland suddenly ornamented with wildflowers she could not name, which had led to her drawing them in the evenings on the teacher's desk, working from the pencils Cyrus had left for her, which had led to Cyrus coming to look over her shoulder one evening and saying, quietly, that she had a real gift, and then standing there longer than strictly necessary with his shoulder almost touching hers. She had begun to understand in June that the feeling was not one-sided. He was not a man who showed it obviously. He did not flirt. He did not make the kind of large, romantic declarations that she supposed some men thought were attractive. What he did was smaller and more devastating. He remembered things. He remembered that she took her coffee without sugar. He remembered that she found the gray mule on the left more stubborn than the one on the right and adjusted the hitch accordingly without being asked. He remembered that she had mentioned in passing, weeks earlier, that she had once seen a performance of Shakespeare in San Antonio and found it changed her entirely. And one evening he placed a complete works of Shakespeare on the table beside her supper plate without a word. And he had built the room. She had not known about the room until the second week of June, when she had gone around the back of the house to hang laundry and found Delbert and Esteban constructing what was clearly a new addition to the east side of the main house. She had stood watching them with her laundry basket on her hip until Cyrus came out of the barn and saw her. He had said, "It will be a proper bedroom. Your room in the house is too small, and it does not have a window facing east." She had been so startled she had said the first thing that came to mind, "You do not need to do that." He had looked at her for a long moment with that opaque, careful expression she still could not always read. Then he had said, "I know," and gone back to the barn. She had thought about that for 3 days before she figured out what it meant. What it meant was that he was building it anyway, not because she required it, not because it was practical, because he wanted her to have a room with a window facing east and a room that was her own size, and though she could not yet allow herself to fully think it because he wanted her to be there long enough to need it. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way you know the season has changed, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small evidence until one morning, you simply cannot pretend anymore that it is still the same as it was. The warmth that spread through her chest when she heard his boots on the porch in the evening. The way the ranch felt like home in a way no place had felt since she was a girl in Fredericksburg. The specific, incandescent pleasure of talking to him about anything at all, water rights or cloud formations, or the chapter of the novel they had both been reading from the same copy, him from the front and her from the back, until they had met somewhere in the middle and sat at the supper table and argued about it for an hour with a joy she had not known was available to her. But the letter was in her apron pocket. And she had told herself and told herself and told herself that she would handle it before it became something he needed to know about. She did not handle it. What happened instead was that on a Monday evening in late June, a hired man she had never seen before rode up to the ranch house at suppertime and knocked on the door while Cyrus was out at the barn, and when Grace answered it, the man handed her a formal-looking envelope and tipped his hat and rode away again without a word. Inside the envelope was a document. It was from a San Antonio law office. It informed Grace Merritt that the debt of $260, the original amount plus interest and fees assessed since Thomas Merritt's death, was now formally pursued against her as surviving heir, and that one Harlan Voss, as holder of the promissory note, was prepared to engage the services of a collections agent to recover said debt through any legal means available, which in the territory of New Mexico could include a judgment against her wages. At the bottom of the formal language, in Voss's own handwriting, was a short note. He would be arriving in the territory at the end of July. He hoped she would be prepared to discuss a settlement that worked for everyone. Grace sat down on the porch steps with the document in her hands and felt the specific, nauseating flavor of a trap closing. She had involved Cyrus Finley without ever meaning to. His ranch was her address of record on every letter she had written since March. Harlan Voss knew exactly where she was. The wages she had been saving, she had been paying down the debt in her own mind, dollar by dollar with every week's wages, but she had barely $60 saved, and a judgment against her wages would take the rest before she had accumulated enough to clear it. And even if she paid every cent, she knew Voss well enough to know that the debt was not really the point. The debt was leverage. The debt was a leash he intended to use to drag her back. She had sat on those porch steps for a long time, looking out at the evening light on the mountains to the north, and she had thought about what kind of woman she wanted to be. She had come to the territory to be a free woman. She had found something she had not planned on finding, a place that felt like it was hers, a man who made her feel like herself, a life that was building itself around her with the same quiet competence that characterized everything Cyrus Finley did. She had a choice now, and both options were terrifying. She could tell him the truth and risk everything she had built here, his trust, his regard, the possibility of whatever this thing between them was becoming. Or she could stay silent and let the trap that Harlan Voss had built for her reach all the way out here to the clean air of the territory and snap shut in the middle of someone else's home. She had still not decided when Cyrus sat down across from her at the supper table 2 evenings later and looked at her with those dark, careful eyes and said the words that split her open like a fault line giving way. "I built that room because I hoped you would stay." Grace finished telling him everything. She told it plainly, without embellishment, which was how she did everything that actually mattered. She told him about Thomas and the debt and Harlan Voss, and the office in San Antonio, and the refusal and the flight north, and the letter in May, and the document from the law office 3 days ago. She told him that she had been a coward about it, that she should have told him at the beginning, that she had no right to bring her hidden trouble to his doorstep without his knowledge, and that she would not blame him for whatever he decided to do with the information now that he had it. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. Cyrus had not moved for the entirety of it. He sat with his hands still flat on the table, and he listened the way he did everything else, completely, without interruption, without the restless shifting that most people could not suppress when they were hearing something difficult. His face had gone through several things she watched carefully, a tightening at the first mention of Voss, a flicker of something older and harder at the word debt, and then, as she got further into it, something that settled into a kind of still, concentrated attention that was not anger, or at least was not anger directed at her. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much?" She blinked. "I am sorry. The debt." "How much does he claim you owe?" $260 with interest added, he nodded slowly. "And you have 60 saved." She had not told him the amount she had saved. She realized he had been paying attention to more than she knew. "Yes," she said, "that leaves $200, approximately." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I can cover that." She felt something cold move through her. "Absolutely not." "It is not charity," he said. "You can pay me back from your wages over 2 years. The rate you are currently earning, it works out to Cyrus." She said his name with enough force that he stopped. "That is not the problem. The problem is not the money. Harlan Voss does not want money. He wants a lever. He wants something to hold over me. Even if the debt is cleared, he will find another way. He will manufacture something or make accusations," or she stopped because her voice was in danger of doing something she refused to let it do. "He is not a man who accepts the word no. I know that because I have said it to him twice and he has not heard it either time." Cyrus absorbed this. He was doing that thing he did sitting with uncomfortable information until he understood its whole shape, not rushing to a response just to fill the silence. "What does he look like?" he asked. She told him. The city suit and the polished boots and the thinning hair and the smile that did not reach his eyes. Cyrus nodded once as if filing this away. "And he said he is coming to the territory at the end of July." He said the end of July. "That gives us perhaps 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Cyrus repeated. He was quiet again, then, as if the decision had already been made somewhere inside him long before this conversation. "You are not going back to San Antonio." It was not phrased as a question. "I had not planned to," she said carefully. "And you are not leaving this ranch." Something shifted in the air between them. She felt it as clearly as she had felt the change of season, something moving, something significant. "You said you built that room hoping I would stay," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Now you know what staying would mean, what it would cost you." He looked at her directly, and there was nothing hidden in his face at that moment, nothing carefully arranged, nothing held in reserve. It was the most open expression she had ever seen on him, and it was exactly as frightening and exactly as wonderful as she had imagined it might be if it ever appeared. "I know what staying would mean," he said. "I am asking you to let me help you handle it." "Why?" She asked because she needed to hear it from him plainly. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. In another man, she might have thought he was calculating. In Cyrus Finley, she understood he was simply choosing words with the same care he gave everything else. "Because I would like," he said, "for you to have a reason to want to stay that is not just desperation. I would like for it to be a choice." Grace looked at him for a long time. "Tell me what you are thinking," she said. What he was thinking, it turned out, was both practical and thorough. The next morning, Cyrus rode into Hartwell and paid a visit to the office of Judge Clarence Abbott, who was also the county recorder and the nearest thing Cimarron County had to a legal authority. He laid out the situation in plain terms: a creditor from San Antonio pursuing a widow for a dead man's debt, arriving in the territory with what appeared to be an intent to harass, and the judge, who had himself been on the receiving end of just such attentions from an Eastern creditor in his younger years, listened with increasing coldness. Judge Abbott said that the law in New Mexico Territory was not hospitable to creditors who came to intimidate women, and that any collections agent who made that attempt on his ground would find the local legal environment distinctly inhospitable. He also said, after looking over the copy of the promissory note that Grace had sent with Cyrus, that the interest additions were not clearly legal under Texas law and certainly not under territorial law, and that the original debt of $200 was the most Voss could realistically pursue in any legitimate venue. Cyrus came home that evening with that information and a plan. They were going to pay the original debt in full, with a formal discharge document signed before witnesses and filed with the county recorder's office. The moment that document was filed, Voss had no legal basis for any further contact. If he arrived in the territory anyway, Judge Abbott had agreed to be available. Cimarron County had also, as of 2 years prior, a new territorial sheriff named Garrett Aldis, who was not the kind of man who tolerated outside interference in his county. Grace sat across the table while Cyrus explained all of this, and she watched the careful deliberateness with which he had constructed a shelter around her, and she felt something shift in her chest that was simultaneously overwhelming and terrifying. "Cyrus," she said, "I cannot let you put $200 against a problem I made." "You did not make this problem," he said. "A man with bad intentions and a dead husband's debt made this problem. You simply had the misfortune of being in the path of it." "The money, I have it," he said simply. "I am not a rich man, but I have it, and I want to use it for this." He looked at her across the table and his voice was very quiet. "Will you let me?" She wanted to say no. She had built her entire sense of herself, in the months since Thomas died, around the ability to manage her own affairs. Accepting help from this man felt enormous and frightening, because accepting something that large meant she was committed to something, meant she could not simply pack her trunk and disappear if the situation became too complicated. But maybe, she thought, that was the point. Maybe the thing she had been most afraid of was not Harlan Voss at all. Maybe it was this, the weight of being somewhere she actually wanted to be. "Yes," she said, "I will let you." The following 10 days were full of motion. Cyrus rode to Hartwell twice more, once to arrange the bank draft, and once to file the discharge document with Judge Abbott's office. Grace wrote a formal letter to the San Antonio law office informing them of the discharge and citing the filed document number, and she sent a separate letter to Harlan Voss directly, in language so precise and so clearly informed by legal consultation that he would know she had not done it alone. In the evenings, during all of this, they had supper together the same as always, but something had changed in the texture of those suppers. The careful distance that Grace had been maintaining, the professional, employer-employee remove she had clung to like a raft, had dissolved. Not dramatically. Nothing with Cyrus was ever dramatic in the theatrical sense, but she found herself telling him things she had not told anyone. About her childhood in Fredericksburg, about her father who had been a doctor and her mother who had played the piano and both of whom had died within a year of each other, when Grace was 16, leaving her in the care of an aunt who was well-meaning, but entirely unsuited for the task of raising a girl who was always thinking too much. About the years of teaching that had been her anchor and her armor both. And he told her things. He told her about his father, who had built the original part of the ranch house in 1861 and run cattle through the Civil War years when everyone around him was doing something else with their lives. He told her about his mother, who had died of a fever when he was 10, and whose garden he still kept in a rough kind of order along the south side of the house, though he had never had much of a hand for flowers. He told her about a woman he had been engaged to 8 years ago, a woman from Taos who had decided after a season on the ranch that the frontier life was not the one she wanted, and who had gone back east without any particular bitterness on either side, but with a lesson Cyrus had apparently taken seriously. He had built the ranch to last. He had built every part of it with the intention of making it a place someone would choose to stay. The tight corrals and the solid barn and the good well, and the kitchen with the proper iron stove, and the schoolroom with its chalkboard, and its eastern-facing windows, and the new bedroom with its window that caught the morning light. He had been building a life for 2 people for 8 years and living it alone, and he had told almost nobody, and the loneliness of it hit Grace like cold water because she recognized it. She had been living in the same house, though hers was made of independence rather than land, all the deliberate sufficiency of a woman who has decided she does not need anything she cannot provide for herself, and the peculiar, hollow exhaustion that comes with maintaining that position year after year. "You could have advertised for a wife," she said one evening, saying it gently but directly. "That is what most men in your position would do." "I advertised for a teacher," he said. "That is not the same thing." "No," he agreed. He looked at his coffee cup. "But it is honest. I wanted someone who was here because the place suited her, not because she needed a husband. I have seen those arrangements." He paused. "They do not always serve either person very well." She thought about Thomas Merritt, and she knew he was right. What if she suited the place, Grace said carefully, and also suited the person? He looked up from the coffee cup then, and the look was slow and deliberate and held every word he had not been able to say yet. "Then," he said, "I would consider myself a very fortunate man." The end of July arrived like a held breath. On a Wednesday afternoon, Sheriff Garrett Aldis rode out to the ranch and told Cyrus that a man fitting Harlan Voss's description had arrived in Hartwell the previous evening on the stage from Santa Fe. He had taken a room at the hotel. He had asked the hotel clerk about the Finley ranch. Cyrus listened to this information and then said, "Thank you, Garrett," the sheriff said. "I expect you'll want to come into town tomorrow." "I do," Cyrus said. Grace was standing on the porch when they had this conversation, and she felt the old fear move through her, cold and specific. The fear of Harlan Voss's smile and his patience and his absolute certainty that the world arranged itself for men like him. But underneath the fear was something new, something that had not been there in San Antonio. Anger. Clean, clear anger. And underneath that, the thing that had been building since March. She was not alone. She had not asked for company in her problems, and she knew the value of being able to stand on her own 2 feet, and she was not the kind of woman who required rescuing. But there was a difference she was realizing between not needing to be rescued and not being willing to stand beside someone who chose to stand beside you. She went inside and got her good coat and her hat. Cyrus was still on the porch when she came back out. He looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "You do not have to come," he said. "No," she agreed. "I do not have to." The ride into Hartwell the next morning was bright and clear. The kind of July day the territory produced that made everything look drawn in sharp lines, every shadow precise and every color saturated. Cyrus drove the wagon and Grace sat beside him, and neither of them talked much. But the silence between them had become, over these past weeks, something inhabited and comfortable rather than something empty. They found Harlan Voss in the hotel lobby. He was exactly as she remembered him, the suit, the polished boots, the thinning hair, the smile that arrived before the rest of his face had committed to any particular emotion. He looked at Grace with an expression of professional satisfaction, as though she were an account finally balancing, and then he looked at Cyrus with an assessing pause that lasted just a half-second too long. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, "I had hoped you might come to me rather than making me come all this way." "Mr. Voss," she said, her voice was level, "you received my letter." "I did." He smiled at the folder in his hand. "I am afraid a letter does not really settle the matter in the way we discussed." "The discharge document filed with the Cimarron County Recorder's office settles it completely," Cyrus said. He did not say it loudly. He said it the way he said most things, in a voice that was quiet enough that you had to pay attention to hear it, which meant you paid attention. Voss looked at him. "And you are?" "Cyrus Finley." He said it simply. "This is my county." Voss adjusted his expression into something more cautious. He had dealt with men like Cyrus before. He was a city man who understood power through money, and he could identify men who had a different kind of power, the kind rooted in knowing a place and being known by it. He recalibrated. "The original debt has been paid," Voss said. "I acknowledge that. However, the manner in which it was handled raises—" "Judge Abbott is in his office this morning," Grace said. "If you have a legal concern, he has agreed to hear it." A pause. Voss looked from her to Cyrus and back again. "It seems," he said carefully, "that you have made arrangements." "I have," Grace said. "And I want you to understand something, Mr. Voss. The debt is cleared, filed, and witnessed. Whatever you came here hoping to find as a second lever, you will not find it. I am employed and I am housed, and I have the support of this county's legal office. If you attempt any further contact regarding Thomas's debt or any fabricated version of it, Judge Abbott has agreed to treat it as harassment and respond accordingly." Voss was quiet for a moment. She watched him calculate, the way he always calculated, measuring what this situation was worth against what it would cost him. She had watched this calculation before in his San Antonio office and had been afraid of its outcome. She was not afraid now. "You have changed," he said, and he did not mean it as a compliment. "Yes," she said, "I have." He left Hartwell on the Friday stage. Judge Abbott confirmed it with a note delivered to the ranch the following morning, and Esteban read it aloud at the breakfast table, and Delbert said something in response that made everyone laugh, and Grace sat at the table with her coffee and felt the specific, spreading warmth of a thing finished. Cyrus was watching her from across the table when she looked up. He was smiling, a real one, not the careful almost smile she usually got, but something wider and more unguarded, and it changed his face so thoroughly that she thought she was seeing something she might spend a very long time looking at. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. And then, because it was true and it deserved to be said aloud, "I am very all right." August on the Finley Ranch was a season of its own kind. The heat was serious but not cruel, tempered in the evenings by a breeze from the mountains that made the cottonwoods along the creek whisper, in a way that Grace had come to love, with the unreasonable intensity of someone who has found exactly the right combination of sounds for falling asleep. The children came on their 3 days a week, and were working through long division with the dogged concentration of people who suspect arithmetic is trying to trick them, but are not going to give it the satisfaction. The cattle were fat and well managed. The new bedroom on the east side of the house was finished, and Grace had moved her things into it, and the first morning she woke there and watched the light come through the east-facing window in long golden bars across the floor, she had pressed her hand flat against the warm adobe wall and felt something she had almost forgotten the feeling of. Gratitude. Not the desperate, obligated kind. The clean kind. She and Cyrus had not spoken directly about what the future might look like. There was still between them the careful propriety of the employer and the teacher, the two adults sharing a house and a supper table, and a great many good conversations. But the thing between them had been growing all summer with the same steady determination as everything else on this ranch, and Grace had stopped pretending she could not feel it. It was a Sunday afternoon in the middle of August when it came forward. She was in the mother's garden on the south side of the house, doing the rough weeding that she had been attempting for several weeks, because Cyrus had said he had no hand for flowers, but she did, and the roses that his mother had planted in the 1860s were struggling under the summer's growth of bindweed. She had her drawing paper with her too, because some of the desert flowers coming in along the garden's edge were extraordinarily small, extravagant, with the color of things that know they will not last long. Cyrus came around the corner of the house with a cup of coffee in each hand, which told her he had been watching the situation from the kitchen window long enough to know she would want one. He sat down in the old wooden chair that had been in the garden since his father's day, and she sat on the ground beside it with her drawing paper, and they were quiet for a while in the best possible way. "Grace," he said eventually. "Yes, I want to ask you something." She put down her pencil and looked up at him. The afternoon light was in his hair and on the side of his face, and he looked like a man who had been about to say something significant several times over the past weeks and had finally decided to stop waiting for the right moment because there was no right moment and the thing needed to be said. "Ask," she said. He looked at her directly. "Would you want to stay? Not because of the debt or the school or the wages, because you want to." She had known, she realized, that this question was coming. Had known it and turned it over and examined it from every angle in those quiet moments between the schoolroom and the supper table and the new bedroom with its east-facing window. "I want to stay," she said. He absorbed this with the stillness that was his particular way of receiving important things. "And the rest of it," he asked, "between us. What are you asking me, Cyrus?" "I am asking," he said carefully, "whether the room I built is enough. Or whether you would consider whether you might want." He stopped, and she watched the careful man struggle briefly with the enormity of what he was trying to say, and she loved him for the struggle, loved him for not having a smooth and practiced speech prepared. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would be willing to share the rest of this house and the rest of this ranch and the rest of what I am trying to build here, not as an employee, as a partner." She looked at him for a long moment. The garden was alive with the sounds of August bees in the roses, the distant creek, the horses moving in the far corral. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "I am," he said. "Badly." "I apologize for the presentation." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her, and she felt it spread through her whole body like light. "Cyrus Finley," she said, "the presentation is exactly right. Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said. "That is absolutely a yes." He set down his coffee cup very carefully on the arm of the wooden chair, with the same deliberateness he gave to every physical action, and then he slid off the chair and sat beside her on the ground and took her hand in both of his, and the size and warmth of his hands around hers was the most comforting thing she had felt in longer than she could measure. They sat there in the August afternoon in the mother's garden, with the roses blooming badly but determinedly around them, and Grace thought that this was what it felt like to be chosen, and to choose. Not out of desperation, not out of necessity, not out of any calculation about what was available or what was possible, but out of the deep and specific conviction that this was the right person in the right place at the right time. They married in September. Judge Abbott conducted the ceremony in the Hartwell Town Square, in the late afternoon when the light was low and golden on the adobe walls of the buildings, and the cottonwoods along the main street had turned the first pale yellow of autumn. Delbert and Esteban were there, and the 5 ranch families whose children attended the school, and several Hartwell townspeople who had met Grace over the summer and apparently decided they were in favor of the match. The sheriff was there too, standing at the back with his hat in his hands and a look of satisfied approval. Grace wore her best blue dress, which was the color of the sky just after the sun is gone, and there is still light but you can see the first stars, and Cyrus wore a clean dark coat that she suspected had been purchased for the occasion in Santa Fe, because she had never seen it before and it fit him very well. When Judge Abbott asked if she took this man, she said yes with the kind of clarity and volume that left no doubt. When he asked if Cyrus took this woman, Cyrus said yes, and then looked at her with the unguarded expression that she had only begun to see in August, the one that was going to be the private language between them for the rest of their lives. They came home to the ranch in the wagon, under a sky full of stars that the territory produced like an extravagance, as though it felt obligated to overdo celestial displays to compensate for being so spare with everything else. The new bedroom had a new quilt on the bed, which Delbert had apparently commissioned from a woman in Hartwell, and which was made in a pattern called wedding ring. Grace was not sure how Delbert had organized this without her knowledge, but she thanked him the next day with the whole of her heart, and he turned the color of beet and said it was nothing and went out to the barn to recover. The first year of their marriage was the year Grace had not known she had been waiting for her whole adult life. The teaching continued, because it was her work and she was good at it, and she refused to give it up, and Cyrus had never once suggested she should. In fact, in November, he rode into Hartwell and made an arrangement with the school families for a small additional fee, which allowed them to purchase a second chalkboard and a proper set of readers for every child in the school. He did this without telling Grace, which she found out when Delbert mentioned it at supper, and which led to the kind of marital argument that is really an expression of love, because what she was actually saying was that she needed to know when he did things for her school, and what he was actually saying was that he wanted to help and did not know how to ask permission. And they resolved it in the time it took to drink 2 cups of coffee and arrive at a system for these kinds of decisions that worked for both of them. They had a great many conversations like that. The ranch had 2 people running it now in the deeper sense, and they were both people with opinions and both people who had been alone long enough to have strong habits, and the work of marriage was the work of making room for another person's whole self without either of you being reduced in the process. They were good at it, on the whole. They argued productively and laughed often and communicated, Grace felt, with the kind of specificity that most couples worked toward for years before achieving. The winter of 1883 was cold, but not cruel. Grace spent it making the house more fully hers, a word that she rolled around in her mind, with a continuing pleasure that had not faded, adding the botanical drawings to the walls in frames that Cyrus built himself from spare timber, teaching her winter students on the days when the cold was not too extreme for the children to ride, and discovering that she was good at things she had not known she had opinions about, like the way the kitchen should be arranged and the variety of medicinal herbs that could be grown in a window box and kept available through winter. In February, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Cyrus at supper. She said it directly, as she said most things that mattered, and she watched his face go through several things in quick succession: surprise, a kind of wondering bewilderment, and then something so openly joyful that she felt her eyes go warm. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and kneeled down, which was not a thing she had ever seen him do in any context, and he took both of her hands and looked at her with everything he felt right there on his face without any of the careful arrangement he usually maintained. "Are you well?" he asked. "Do you feel well?" She laughed. "I feel perfectly well, Cyrus." "We should send for Dr. Prentice," he said. Dr. Prentice was the closest physician, which meant 40 miles to the east, but this did not appear to factor into Cyrus's calculation. "In March," she said. "I will write to him in March." He was quiet for a moment, still kneeling, still holding her hands. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you." She looked at him. "What are you thanking me for?" "For being here," he said. "For staying." She thought of that September evening at the supper table, the lamplight and the shock of it, the room he had built that she had not known about, the words that had landed between them like something finally said after too long unsaid. She had not known then what she knew now, that the room had been the first of many things he would build for her, not because she required them but because he wanted her to have them. That the ranch was big enough for 2 kinds of life, her work and his, and that they could both live fully within it without reducing each other. "I am here," she said, simply and completely. Dr. Prentice confirmed in March that the baby would come in late September, which struck Grace as a wonderful coincidence, though she did not say so because she was not superstitious. She said it to Cyrus that evening, and he smiled and said she was not superstitious. She agreed, but she liked it nonetheless. The spring of 1884 was a good one on the ranch. The cattle had wintered well, and Cyrus expanded the herd in April with 20 head purchased from a ranch to the north, negotiated through a man named Arlo Pierce, who came to the ranch for the transaction and ate supper with them, and spent the whole evening directing his conversation exclusively at Cyrus in the way that some men of that era did, as though Grace were furniture. Cyrus, without making a production of it, redirected every single one of Pierce's questions toward Grace whenever it touched on the management of the ranch or the school, and when Pierce said something that was not quite but was almost dismissive about a woman's capacity to manage accounts, Cyrus said, in his quiet and unremarkable way, that Grace managed the ranch accounts and that they were in the best order they had been in since his father's day. Pierce looked at Grace with revised attention, and Grace smiled at him pleasantly, and after he left, Cyrus sat at the supper table and said he was sorry for Pierce's manners, and Grace said that she had dealt with worse and appreciated how Cyrus had handled it, and Cyrus said he had not handled it particularly well because he had wanted to say something considerably less polite, and she laughed and said that was exactly the right instinct. Their son was born on the 28th of September, 1884, in the bedroom with the east-facing window, with Dr. Prentice in attendance and Delbert pacing the front porch for 4 hours, until Esteban made him sit down and drink coffee. They named him James after Cyrus's father, and William after Grace's. James William Finley arrived in the world with the particular determination of someone who has decided to be here and is not going to be quiet about it, and the first week of his life was a wonder and an education, and an exhaustion so profound that Grace and Cyrus spent an entire evening sitting at the supper table saying very little, just passing him back and forth between them with the careful reverence of people who cannot quite believe the thing they are holding. "He looks like you," Grace said. "He looks like neither of us yet," Cyrus said. "He looks like a person who has just arrived and is deciding what he thinks of the place." "What do you think he thinks?" Cyrus looked at the baby, and the baby, with the unfocused intensity of newborns, appeared to look back at him. "I think he approves," Cyrus said. "He has good taste." Grace laughed, and James made a sound that might have been his first opinion on the matter. The school continued through all of this. Grace had arranged, during the summer, for the daughter of one of the ranch families, a 17-year-old girl named Ruth Calloway, who had been Grace's best student, and was headed for a teacher's certificate at the normal school in Santa Fe the following year, to cover the teaching for the 2 weeks around the birth and the month that followed, with full pay from the school fund and Grace's detailed lesson plans. It worked well. Ruth was talented and the children liked her, and Grace found that stepping back from the classroom for those weeks gave her perspective on how much she loved returning to it. James was 5 weeks old the first time Grace stood at the front of the classroom again, and she felt something that she would remember for the rest of her life. The complete fullness of having multiple things that mattered, none of which diminished the others. The years that followed built themselves with the steady, layered quality of something well-made. Esteban married in 1885, a woman named Lucia from the town of Hartwell, who was the finest cook in the county, which Delbert said was the most important qualification anyone could have, and which everyone suspected he meant entirely seriously. Lucia became a regular presence at the ranch, and the suppers grew larger and louder and considerably more elaborate, and Grace was glad of the company and the warmth of it. Delbert himself was aging, and by 1886 he had moved from the harder ranch work to what he called supervision, which meant he sat in the barn on a stool and told Cyrus what needed to be done and why, and Cyrus listened to approximately 70% of it and implemented the 70% that was correct. Delbert, who had known Cyrus since he was a boy, understood this arrangement perfectly and was not offended by it. They hired 2 new hands in 1885, brothers named Tom and Pete Alderman, young and willing and in need of steady work, who turned out to be decent cowboys and even better company, with a gift for music that meant the bunkhouse had fiddle music on Saturday evenings that drifted across the yard and into the house where Grace and Cyrus sat on the porch and listened in the dark. James grew with the appetite and speed of frontier children, which is to say rapidly and completely. He was walking by one and talking by 1.5 and asking questions about everything by 2, and by the time he was 3, he had attached himself to Esteban as the primary person of interest in his world, following him around the barn and corrals with the focused attention of a person conducting research. Esteban was delighted and taught James to saddle a horse in stages over the course of his 4th year, which Cyrus watched with the particular expression of a father who is simultaneously terrified and proud. In the spring of 1887, Grace's drawing had grown into something she had not planned. The botanical drawings, which had begun as personal pleasure, had attracted the attention of a professor at the University of New Mexico who was conducting a survey of native plant species in the territory. He wrote to her, through the school, somehow, which suggested her work had been seen by someone asking if she would be willing to contribute illustrations to a publication he was preparing. He offered payment and credit. She told Cyrus at supper. He looked at her across the table with the expression that by now she knew was his happiness made visible in his face, the careful man completely unguarded. "You should do it," he said. "It will take a significant amount of time." "The plants are not going anywhere," he said, "and neither are you." She accepted the professor's offer and spent the next 2 years producing the drawings that would be published in 1889 as part of a formal botanical survey of New Mexico Territory's native flora. 14 of the illustrations were credited to Grace Finley, née Merritt, Cimarron County. When the published volume arrived at the ranch in the fall of 1889, Cyrus placed it on the bookshelf between the Shakespeare and the Geological Survey, and the next day Grace found that he had somehow. She never asked exactly how arranged for a second copy to be placed in the schoolroom. She had found it during a lesson and stood still for a moment with her hand on the cover, and the children had waited, and then she had opened it to her illustrations and explained to the children what botanical illustration was, and why it mattered, and what the plants shown were called, and where they grew, and what made each one unique. It had been, by general agreement among the students, the best lesson of that entire year. Their daughter arrived in the autumn of 1888, a girl they named Clara Elizabeth, after Cyrus's mother and Grace's best friend from her Fredericksburg years, who had sent a beautiful lace shawl from back east when she received the wedding announcement. Clara was born with Grace's coloring, and what appeared within her first few weeks to be Cyrus's deliberate temperament, a baby who looked at things carefully before deciding what she thought about them, which made her easier in some ways and more interesting in all of them. James, at 4, approached his sister with the gravity of someone who has been told about a significant change in the organization of his world and has decided to withhold judgment until he has more information. He assessed her at length. Then he announced that she was very small but probably useful, which Esteban claimed was the most diplomatic thing he had heard said in Cimarron County since the governor's last visit. The ranch expanded in 1889. Cyrus purchased an adjacent section of land from a rancher who was moving his family to Colorado, adding pasture to the east that had good grass and access to a seasonal creek. It required new fencing and some work on the waterworks, and the summer of 1889 was a working summer on the Finley Ranch in the most comprehensive sense, with every hand engaged and Cyrus out before sunrise and Grace managing not only the school but the domestic side of the larger operation, with an efficiency that she had developed gradually, and without particularly noticing it. By evening they were both tired in the way that comes from a full day of necessary work, and supper had resumed its early function, the two of them at the table, food doing most of the talking while they recovered. But the silence between them was the richest kind by now, 20-year-old silence, deeply inhabited, full of all the things that did not need to be said because they had been said or were simply understood. One evening in late August of 1889, Grace looked up from the letter she was writing to the botanical professor and found Cyrus watching her from across the table with the same expression he had had in the garden that Sunday afternoon 5 years ago, the unguarded one, the one that was the private language between them. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, and then, "just looking." She felt the warmth of it all the way through. "You have been looking for 6 years." "I expect to be looking for a good while longer," he said, entirely seriously. She set down her letter. "Cyrus, Grace, you are the best person I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I think you may be biased." "I am certain I am biased," she agreed. "It does not make it less true." He looked at her for another moment, and then he got up from his side of the table and came around to hers, and sat down beside her in the way he had sat beside her in the garden. And they were still in the quiet kitchen with the sound of the summer outside the windows and the children asleep in their rooms and the whole solid, real, built life surrounding them. And Grace thought she had not known, 6 years ago, sitting across this table from a man who had said something that cracked her open, that it was possible to be this comprehensively happy. It was possible, it turned out. Delbert died in the winter of 1890, quietly in his sleep, in the room above the barn that had been his home for 30 years. He was 71 years old and had seen the ranch through 3 decades and 2 generations, and had opinions about everything, and had been entirely correct about 70% of them. Cyrus took the news with the stillness that Grace had learned was his grief, a private, held thing that he processed in his own time, and did not pretend was smaller than it was. They buried him on the ranch, under the cottonwood at the edge of the creek that he had always said was the best spot on the property. And Grace thought of how Delbert had paced the porch the night James was born and commissioned the wedding ring quilt, and she let herself cry at the graveside without embarrassment, because the old man had deserved to be mourned properly. Esteban took on more of the senior role after that, with Tom Alderman stepping up as well, and the ranch adjusted as working places adjust, with some grief, with some reorganization, with the eventual equilibrium that comes from people who are committed to the same enterprise. James turned 6 in 1890 and started attending his mother's school as a student, which was an interesting adjustment for both of them. He was a good student and a quietly competitive one, and he clearly found it uncomfortable to be simultaneously proud of his mother and obligated to pretend that the teacher was not also the person who made his breakfast. Grace found it entertaining. She made no special exceptions for him and offered no mercy when his arithmetic was wrong, and by Christmas she had concluded that he was going to be fine at whatever he decided to do in the world. Clara at 2 was an entirely different kind of project. She had opinions about things that a 2-year-old did not typically have opinions about: the arrangement of objects on surfaces, the sequence of daily activities, the correct way to hold a drawing pencil, which she had identified by watching her mother, and had now adopted with a proprietary certainty that Grace found both comic and moving. She was going to be something, Clara. Grace could not yet see exactly what, but she had the feeling she would know it when she saw it. The new decade opened with the territory changing around them. New Mexico in 1890 was not the New Mexico of 1883. The Santa Fe Railway had changed the access to the territory in ways both good and complicated. More settlers were coming in, which meant more pressure on land and water rights, which meant the quiet certainties of the ranching life were becoming more contested. Cyrus followed these developments with careful attention, and Grace followed them too, because the school was also changing more children in the county now, and the 5 families who had originally sent their children to the Finley Ranch School had grown to 8 families and 17 students, which was the maximum the schoolroom could hold. In the spring of 1891, Grace raised with Cyrus the possibility of expanding the school. Not the room itself, she explained. There was not space to expand it without making the house uncomfortable. What she meant was the establishment of a proper district school in Hartwell, with a building of its own and a paid teacher's position funded by the county. She had been corresponding with the territorial school board for 2 years on the subject. The board was interested. The county commissioner was interested. What was needed was a local advocate with standing in the community. "You have that standing," Cyrus said. "I would need to make a formal proposal," she said. "Attend meetings in Hartwell, spend time on it." He looked at her steadily. "Grace, I have never once suggested you should spend less time on something you cared about." "I know," she said. "I just wanted us to decide it together." He was quiet for a moment, and then something that was not quite a smile but was in the family of smiles appeared on his face. "Decide together," he repeated. 6 years married and you still want my vote on your school business. "I want your opinion on anything that affects our time in our household," she said. "That is not the same as asking for permission." "No," he agreed. "It is considerably better." He looked at her. "Do it. Build the school. You have been teaching other people's children in a room built for one family. They deserve better." The Hartwell District School was proposed to the County Commissioner's office in the fall of 1891, formally approved and funded in the spring of 1892, and its building was completed by the summer of that same year. Grace had been the primary advocate, attending every meeting, writing every proposal, negotiating the location and the budget and the hiring of a second teacher. A young woman named Alma Briggs, who had just received her certificate from the normal school in Santa Fe, with the same thorough competence she brought to everything else. At the opening of the school in September of 1892, Grace gave a short speech that she had written in the kitchen one evening, while Cyrus sat across the table reading and James did homework and Clara drew on the back of old letters. And the speech was about what it meant for children in isolated places to have access to real education, and what that access might build, generation by generation, in the territory and in the country. Judge Abbott was there, considerably older now but still sharp, and he told Grace afterward that it was the best speech he had heard in Cimarron County in 20 years, which she suspected was not entirely true but appreciated entirely anyway. The Finley Ranch School became, officially, a part of the new Hartwell district. Grace taught there 3 days a week herself, making the ride into town in the early morning and back in the late afternoon, and the other 2 days were Alma's. The arrangement suited both of them and suited the children, who had gone from 12 to 23 in enrollment, and were being taught history and literature and basic science as well as the fundamentals. James was 9 by then, and had become the kind of student who asked questions that temporarily stopped the lesson, while his mother or Miss Briggs worked out how to answer them properly, which annoyed the other students and delighted Grace in a way she was careful not to show too obviously. Clara was 4 and had begun drawing in earnest proper drawings, of the horses in the corral and the flowers in her grandmother's garden, and the profile of her father sitting in the wooden chair on the porch in the evenings. Grace looked at them with an objective eye and found them technically astonishing for the age, and quietly sent a description of them to her professor contact in Albuquerque, who wrote back suggesting that if the child maintained this interest, there were developing resources for artistic education in the territory that had not existed 10 years prior. "Your daughter is going to draw things," Grace told Cyrus. "I know," he said. He had been watching Clara's drawings for over a year. "She draws me as bigger than I am." "You are her father," Grace said. "That is exactly as it should be." He looked at her for a moment, and what was in his face was the specific, quiet happiness of a man whose life has turned out considerably better than he had allowed himself to hope. In 1893, Grace discovered she was expecting again. She was 34 years old, which she noted without anxiety because she was in good health and the territory had been good to her. And she told Cyrus in the kitchen after supper when the children were in bed, saying it with the directness she had always used for important things, and watching his face go through its familiar sequence of surprise and wonder and unguarded joy. Their second son arrived in January of 1894, which made the beginning of his life a cold one, but he appeared entirely indifferent to the cold. They named him Robert, after no one in particular, but simply because they both liked the name, and had been arguing about it in the pleasant way that couples argue about things they are both happy about either way. Robert Finley was a child of a different character from both his siblings. Where James was deliberate and Clara was precise, Robert was relentlessly good-humored, a baby who seemed to regard the world as a production organized specifically for his entertainment, and who was not wrong to do so, because the Finley Ranch in 1894 was a rich and interesting place to arrive in. Esteban and Lucia's children were there, 3 of them by then, ranging from 6 to 10, and James was 9 and Clara was 6, and there were horses and dogs and chickens, and the creek in summer, and the whole complicated, beautiful machinery of the working ranch. Cyrus was 44 that year, and wore it with the same economy he wore everything else, harder-edged in the face, slightly slower in the mornings, but entirely in his power in every way that mattered. He had, over the decade of their marriage, become a man that Grace could read in the finest gradations. The difference between the silence that meant contentment and the silence that meant he was working something out. The look that meant he was proud of something and was not going to say so. The very different look that meant he had something difficult to tell her and was gathering himself. She caught that look one evening in the spring of 1894, when Robert was 3 months old and Clara was obsessively drawing the baby and James had started asking about cattle prices with the focused interest of someone who is beginning to understand that ranching is a business. "Tell me," she said at supper. He looked up. "Tell you what?" "Whatever you have been deciding how to tell me for the past 3 days." He was quiet for a moment, and then something in his face relaxed into the familiar open expression. "I have been thinking about the land." "Which part of the land?" "The north section. The Beaumont family, the Beaumonts were their nearest neighbors to the north, are selling. Their eldest son does not want the ranching life. They are asking a fair price." She looked at him. "How much land?" "Another section. Good grass, 2 reliable springs, access to the ridge trail that would make the summer grazing considerably easier." She did the arithmetic in her head, a habit she had developed, going over the ranch finances alongside Cyrus so thoroughly that she understood the numbers as well as he did. They had a good year behind them, the herd was strong, the mortgage on the east section was nearly paid. It was possible. "You want it," she said. "I do," he said, "but it is a significant decision." She looked at him across the supper table in the kerosene light, in the kitchen of the house he had built and she had made a home, with the sound of the children moving toward sleep in the rooms around them and the whole living ranch outside the walls. "Then let us buy it," she said. He smiled. The wide one, the unguarded one, the one that had arrived first in August of 1883 in the mother's garden and had never entirely gone away since. The Beaumont section was purchased in the summer of 1894, and the fencing and waterworks were completed by fall, and the Finley Ranch was now the largest operation in the county by a comfortable measure. Not wealthy in the way that Eastern money was wealthy, but solid, the kind of solid that comes from doing the right thing consistently for a long time, from maintaining what needs to be maintained and building what needs to be built and choosing, every day, to stay. Grace was thinking about that word the evening of their 12th anniversary, in September of 1895, sitting at the supper table after the children had been dispatched to bed, and the dishes were done and Cyrus had poured 2 small glasses of the brandy that Esteban kept for special occasions and produced without announcement. 12 years, she said. 12 years, he agreed. He looked at his glass. Longer than I lived in this house before you came. She looked at him. Do you ever think about what it was like before? He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was giving the question real thought rather than a comfortable answer. Yes, he said. I think it was very quiet in a way that I told myself was what I wanted. And now, he looked at her steadily. Now it is loud, he said, and that is considerably better, she laughed. Outside, somewhere in the dark of the ranch yard, one of the horses was moving in the corral, and the cottonwoods along the creek were doing the whispering thing she had loved since her first summer here, and the lamp on the table threw amber light across the face of the man she had found across a supper table 12 years ago, when his honesty had broken through her defenses like water finding the crack in stone. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Cyrus," she said. "Grace. Thank you for building the room." He turned his hand under hers and held it with the same warmth and deliberateness she had felt in the garden that first August, and would feel for every year that followed. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for staying in it." They sat there in the kitchen of the house that was entirely theirs, with the world settled around them like something that had finally found its proper arrangement, and the life they had built out of trust and honesty, and the particular courage of two people deciding to choose each other every day, breathed around them in all its ordinary, extraordinary fullness. James grew into a rancher in his father's mold, deliberate and capable and deeply attached to the land, and took on the management of the north section before he was 25, working alongside his father with a natural ease that told Grace everything she needed to know about what they had built. Clara went to Santa Fe at 18, and then to the University of New Mexico, and became the illustrator she had always been going to become, and published a collection of her work at 26 that had her mother's botanical drawings as its dedicatory frontispiece, a choice that Grace discovered sitting at the kitchen table opening the package from the publisher, and which made her cry in the good way for 20 minutes. Robert, the good-humored boy who had arrived in January and found the world entertaining, became a doctor trained in Albuquerque and returned to the territory to practice in Hartwell, which meant he was close enough to come to supper most Sundays, which was an arrangement that made Cyrus quietly and comprehensively satisfied. In 1901, when Grace was 42 and Cyrus was 52, and the ranch was in its most prosperous iteration yet, they sat across the supper table one evening in September. The same table, the same kitchen, the same amber lamplight, and Grace looked at the man she had arrived as a stranger to and become inseparable from, and thought about the room he had built before she knew she was going to stay. She thought about how many rooms they had built since then, not all of them in the literal sense, rooms of trust and understanding and shared work, and the long, deep intimacy of people who have chosen each other across every difficulty the world offered. She thought about how she had come to this territory running from something and had found, instead of a hiding place, a home. Not a home in the building sense, though the building was also a home in the person sense, in the sense of a man who listened completely and acted carefully and loved thoroughly, and had the wisdom to know that the right question was not whether she needed him, but whether she wanted to stay. She had wanted to stay. She still did. The lamp was the same kind as always, kerosene, the steady amber light, and the table was the same table, though it had been repaired twice and refinished once, and outside the cottonwoods were doing the September thing where the leaves were just beginning to gold at the edges, and Cyrus was looking at her from his side of the table with the expression that had been the private language between them for 18 years. "What?" she asked, the way she always asked. "Nothing," he said, the way he always said. And then, just looking. She reached across the table, and the distance between them was exactly the same as it had always been, close enough to reach across, far enough to be two whole people, exactly right. "Look as long as you like," she said. And the lamp burned steadily, and the evening settled in around them, and the life they had chosen again and again and again, across every difficulty and every revelation and every ordinary evening that was also, in its own quiet way, a miracle, continued forward into the good, open, unfinished country of all the years still ahead of them.